Welcome to episode 1 of This Is Why I Hate Watching TV. Today we're discussing Mackenzie Shirilla's case. Feather, where the hell have you been? On hiatus, duh. And why the hell are you wearing a sweater? Because it's 90 degrees outside. Inside it's 67 degrees, and whenever it's under 72, I'm at death's door. So why don't you send help? Okay, seriously, I can't sit through a movie. As much as I try, I fall asleep. My husband hates me for it. He's threatened divorce. I don't know what to tell you. I just don't like doing it. But when it comes to true crime documentaries, I can almost pay attention, especially if it's well done. Now, in this particular case, The Crash came out on Netflix, but there are several documentaries that I feel you should be watching if you want to get a well-rounded picture of this case. We'll go over that later on. First, a little background. Mackenzie Shirilla was 17 years old when she drove her car into a brick building in Strongsville, Ohio in July of 2022. Inside that car were Dominic Russo, her then boyfriend, and Davion Flanagan, their friend. Both young men died as a result of that crash. Mackenzie survived, but suffered extensive injuries. At first, this was viewed as a horrific accident, but as investigators dug deeper, the evidence started pointing somewhere else. Evidence showed the car was traveling close to 100 miles per hour before crashing into the brick building. The black box data showed a sustained speed, in other words, pedal to the metal, with no attempts to brake in the final seconds before impact. The crash happened in a random industrial location that was not tied to any normal route home. There was no reasonable explanation for why they would have taken that route. There was also prior conflict in Mackenzie and Dominic's relationship, including evidence that pointed to threatening behavior and, at the very least, suggested that there were some violent tendencies in the relationship. And then there was her behavior after the crash. One detail that is hard to overlook is what she allegedly said from the hospital after the crash while she was being treated for her injuries. This included asking if she could just have her license suspended for 10 years as punishment for the crash that took her boyfriend and her friend's life. And then there's the moment where she allegedly switched into what has been described as Carney, or a gibberish language similar to Pig Latin, to ask her mother if they could tell police she, quote, had a seizure or something. Mackenzie was ultimately charged with 12 counts, including 4 counts of murder. She was convicted in a bench trial in 2023 and sentenced to 2 15 years to life sentences, to be served concurrently, meaning at the same time, as opposed to consecutively, meaning back-to-back. She is currently incarcerated, and in September of 2024, her first appeal was denied after the 8th District Court of Appeals found no merit in her arguments and upheld her convictions. Later, in an appeal to the Ohio Supreme Court, her attorneys tried to raise additional arguments, including issues tied to evidence and trial counsel, but that filing was dismissed as untimely, and the appeals court affirmed that dismissal, finding that the court does not have jurisdiction to consider the merits because the filing came too late. Now, there are documentaries out there. Obviously, The Crash came out on Netflix, where you get to hear from her directly. But I agree with the general consensus online that watching these 3 will give you a very well-rounded picture of the case. They each include different details that I think are pertinent. There is also a longer documentary on YouTube. It's a few hours long that I thought did a really good job of breaking this down. It included phone call audio from prison where Mackenzie is speaking to her mother, as well as legal arguments that were made during trial. Now, I've got 3 thoughts that I want to talk about. Psychologically, I'm not here to diagnose Mackenzie. I'm not certified to do that, but I am comfortable identifying behavior, and everything I've learned and everything I've researched does allow me to firmly believe that she has narcissistic tendencies. The more that I expose myself to true crime and the more that I see these personality types, the more I think that people with narcissistic tendencies make terrible criminals because they overestimate their ability to perform empathy. I lean hard on this because I think of cases like Chris Watts, where their inability to successfully perform empathy is so painfully obvious, it becomes part of the evidence in the case used against them. And when it comes to The Crash, where Mackenzie is being interviewed, she's trying so hard to emote empathy and emote one feeling while her body language is clearly telling us another, and it's kind of disturbing and pitiful to watch. And to me, that's where narcissistic behavior becomes its own downfall, because while this person thinks that they are controlling the narrative or that they are being successful at it, their own lack of self-awareness tells on them every time. Now, legally speaking, I guess I understand why these sentences are concurrent given her age. The judge does not seem confident that she will ever come out of prison, given her stance on the fact that this was not intentional and she is not accepting responsibility for the crash. However, I'm assuming that she is factoring in the possibility that this inmate could be reformed. Regardless, when we get to parole, and which is 15 years down the line, is it fair to the victims' families for them to have to show up and have to re-argue every 5 years until she is, or if she's ultimately paroled. But is it fair to the families to have to make them have to re-argue the value and the impact of the absence in their families' lives? Like, I just feel like, I don't know, I just feel like that places an unfair emotional burden on the families. And then socially, what happens when someone is convicted of a case like this and then they eventually are released and then they try to turn their infamy into a monetized platform? I can totally see that happening. In fact, Dominic Russo just did an interview about this recently where she talked about the fact that she does see Mackenzie trying to use this case for attention or profit. I can see that 100%. And is it fair that they get to use their notoriety to start a platform? Ultimately, this case is tragic, and I personally struggle to empathize with anybody who shows a lack of remorse or tries to make excuses for the behavior that led to these young boys' death. My empathy squarely lies with Dominic and Davion. I pray that they are at rest, and I pray that their family is actively healing. That is not a linear process. Dealing with loss of that magnitude and in a malicious way is something that I'm sure is really hard to come back from. However, I want to know your thoughts. Let me know. What did you think about this case? Did you watch the documentaries? What was the most disgusting detail for you? Because I really want to hone in on the things. There's so much in this case, and it's so nuanced. So let me know what your thoughts are, and I'll catch you in the next one.